Hey, everybody. It's another bonus episode of Blowback Season 3. And in this episode, Noah is going to speak to a longtime journalist and observer of Korean affairs, Tim Shorrock. Tim has a particular family history and personal history that allowed him to end up in Asia. And he's going to talk about a bit of that, how he grew up really close to quite momentous events in Japan and in Korea, South Korea in particular. And across the conversation, they're going to talk about the U.S. involvement in reshaping these societies after World War II. We're going to talk about the political changes that racked South Korea as the decades went on, and also about the nuclear crisis that came up in the 90s and where things may be headed now. So enjoy this episode with Tim Shorrock.
So as a place to start, for you, the subject of not just the Korean War, but American influence in politics in East Asia generally, it's not just like close to home. It starts, kind of from home. So I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about, how your family story in part led you to this as a, sort of lifelong vocation.
Well, I grew up in Japan and South Korea, and I first arrived in Japan at age 1 in 1952 during the actual U.S. occupation. My parents first went to Japan in 1947, working for the Disciples of Christ Missionary Society. And they basically went in those first year and a half or so as teachers and to go help Japan with the horror of the end of the war. And, Japan was basically flat on its back after months and months of relentless American bombing, and Japanese people, that citizens inside the country were near starvation, and people were just stunned from the collapse of their 5,000-year-old empire. And, so they went. My dad was the very first missionary to get approved to come into Japan during the occupation, the first missionary who had not served before the war. But after a while, they started working kind of hand in hand with the U.S. occupation forces, teaching, and also starting in about 1948 or so, my dad was working with the World Council of Churches and an organization called Church World Service. He was working with refugees, spent a lot of time helping settle refugees that were coming out of China and out of Korea after World War II and then the Korean War. But they were not really missionaries in terms of proselytizing people. They were more like social workers. And Church World Service, which was a very large relief organization around the world, was actually kind of a contractor for the U.S. occupation forces. They were there for all that time, and I was actually born in the first year of the Korean War. And so my dad had gone to Korea for the World Council of Churches in 1949. The idea was to help build homes for refugees who had fled North Korea. Because a lot of the Christian population in North Korea went south after the division. So he went to Korea in 1949 and had his eyes kind of open because he had been in the Navy. He'd been in Navy intelligence. That's how he learned his Japanese, was in naval intelligence schools that they taught Japanese to people to basically to interrogate Japanese POWs. And, he was an anti-fascist, soldier like a lot of World War II vets. And he was very shocked when he went to South Korea in 1949 to find that the police chief was an open admirer of Hitler, and that there was all these right-wing youth groups going around marching and, beating up leftists and beating up trade unionists, and the right wing was really strong. And so he was really kind of shocked by this. So he wasn't really surprised when the Korean War began, just 6 months after he was there, because he knew that political tensions were very high.
Yeah. And there's, it's interesting, I guess, then, so to sort of start with what characterized the Japanese occupation? Like if your dad played one role, in sort of helping to administer relief aid through the sort of, religious NGOs of, the churches that network that he was a part of. You also had obviously there was a military government and a military occupation component to it as well that was introducing social reforms. And then a very different, a different version or a different, arm of that was administering something similar, perhaps more brutal, depending on one's perspective, in Korea. Could you talk a little bit, I guess, about first this, Japanese military occupation and what that looked like?
Well, first of all, it was Korea that got the occupation that Japan should have had. So what happened in Japan was, there was an unconditional surrender after the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was also timed because the U.S. was concerned about the Soviet Union's advances in Manchuria and into Korea. So there was like a, rush to end the war and to determine that U.S. would occupy the southern half of Korea. But, in those first years of the war in Japan, it was reform. And the whole idea was to try to turn around the society that had created this, militarization that had invaded China, colonized Korea, and invaded the Philippines and all throughout Southeast Asia, and really, cruelly oppressed people in that whole region. So, the occupation, first of all, they freed political prisoners, which meant they freed many, many communists who had been jailed during the war and from before the war because they opposed the imperial system. And they gave, wrote laws to give women the right to vote, wrote a new constitution. But the thing that was interesting about Japan as opposed to Korea was in Japan, the U.S. allowed the government to function as it was. I mean, except for a few people at the top, the government was the same government that was making war on the U.S. just a month earlier.
And how did this sort of manifest, I guess, in terms of the administration of policy and day-to-day life, that kind of continuity you're describing?
Well, when the U.S. started pushing through all of its reforms, most of which went through in the first couple of years, there was huge, pushback by the Japanese government and by the Japanese bureaucracy. And so, in fact, when Japanese officials of this government first learned that there might be a U.S. military government imposed on Japan, they went right to MacArthur and tried to change his mind, and in fact did change his mind. He said, "Okay, we're not going to have a military government. We'll let the government function." And then the U.S. occupation basically gave orders to the Japanese government to carry out these reforms. And, they started breaking up the zaibatsu, which were the big, conglomerates that had, been the military industrial complex of Japan, basically. And, there was a tremendous surge of, democratic rights. People took advantage of it. Unions just grew like crazy. People started joining unions. Unions were going on strike, and there was workers were actually, when capitalists in Japan started holding back and not, uncertain, not keeping their factories going, uncertain of the future, workers took the factories over and kept running them themselves to produce, goods for the Japanese people. And so there was this whole explosion of all kinds of organizing in the Communist Party because they had opposed Japanese militarism, had a lot of respect within the Japanese people. And so, pretty soon, one of the stated reasons that General MacArthur wanted missionaries was he thought that Japan had to be Christianized. Japan needed Christian religion so it wouldn't go communist. He said that in black and white.
Yeah, actually, could you elaborate a little bit on the kind of, it's interesting, right? Like your parents represent, I think, like one form of this kind of, Christian relief and aid or how Christianity fits into engaging with the world more broadly, Who was, I guess, what was the sort of, I guess, class or stratum of society and people whom that represented and, who MacArthur was, an agent of, in a sense, I guess?
Well, I think that the American people, by a large, proportion at that time, wanted to have, really radical change in Japan, because they'd been, after all, Japan had attacked the United States, and people knew about this, fanaticism on the battlefield, and just the way that the war was fought, so people really wanted a radical transformation. But I think that the Christianity, missionaries would follow, gunboats in, wherever they went, American gunboats. The American gunboats opened Japan in 1868, and a couple of years later, there was missionaries, right, try to Christianize the population. In the occupation of Japan, a similar thinking was at work, except it was like Christianity. They saw it, the occupation forces, and a lot of people in the U.S. government, including President Truman, saw it as, Americanizing. They'll adopt the Christian religion, which means they'll be pro-American. They'll adopt American values. So it was a mixture of, both religion and also just, American values of democracy and so on that they were trying to, teach the Japanese.
And so, I mean, to your point then, at the origin of that, then I guess, is there at least not origin point, but a really significant point of origin is, Syngman Rhee coming into his oats as the leader of Republican, as the leader of the ROK, imported from the US. You've written about and studied a lot the nature of his, police state. So, we've talked about, I think here maybe is probably a good point to ask you a little bit about, how you got into journalism and ended up first reporting on these subjects.
Well, I was 9 years old, and I was in South Korea, and there was a revolution against Rhee. That Rhee got toppled by a student-led revolution. People went in the streets. Hundreds of people were mowed down by police and military gunfire until the military decided, this revolution has a point, and we're not going to support it. We're not going to support putting it down. The military joined the revolution, basically. I saw that, and my mind was blown. I was only 9 years old, but this, I'd learned in school about the revolution, and here was a revolution happening before my eyes. And so, I really remember that day, April 19th, the big day of the revolution in South Korea. And, I made a scrapbook out of it, which I still have. That was kind of like my first journalism, right? And I always stayed really interested in, how this country that I knew as I knew as a kid, how they could have this revolution when I knew that, they had this, fear of communism, and so many people were anti-communist. But, so that was a big lesson to me. In 1972, when I was in college, I went to Korea, and it happened to be the first day that North Korean diplomats they were with the Red Cross, had come to South Korea since the end of the war. And these buses of North Korean came through as a result of an agreement between Kim Il-sung in the North and Park Chung-hee in the South to have meetings leading toward talking about unification. And because I'd lived in Seoul as a kid and knew people that really hated the communists and hated the North Koreans, I thought there'd be hostility toward these North Koreans that came through. But to my astonishment, people were crying with joy and leaping up and down and reaching toward the buses. And the North Koreans opened the windows, and people were touching their hands. And it was, I'm like, whoa, there's a strong national feeling here that I never knew about. And, during the late 60s, I was in Japan in high school. And my father was running he was the vice president at that time of a large Christian university in Tokyo that actually had been funded and supported by the U.S. occupation. But students in Japan at that time were, no matter if they were Christian or what, were opposing the U.S.-Japan military alliance. And I saw the biggest demonstrations I have ever seen in my life in downtown Tokyo in 1967 and 68, 69. And the movement, anti-war movement there was incredibly strong. I mean, people in, towns where, Sasebo in the south, when the U.S. nuclear submarine came in, the whole city came out to oppose this nuclear sub. And people were, demonstrating at the U.S. bases because at that time they were bombing Vietnam from Japanese bases. And so, I saw this people rise up, and I really wanted to understand what had happened when I had grown up there. Once I became an adult and finished college, I was involved in the anti-war movement against Vietnam and anti-draft, and so I was very active after college in opposing, trying to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. And when it happened in 1975, I remember that right after the Vietnamese kicked the U.S. out, and that withdrawal and the helicopters landing in Saigon and going to the aircraft carriers and that massive, exit. All of a sudden, there was this staged, the U.S. government, the Ford administration put out all these warnings that, North Korea is about to invade South Korea, so we got to prepare for that. And it was like a war scare that lasted about 6 days. And it struck me at the time, like, there's a lot going on in Korea. I got to go back and see what the hell's going on there. And so I started, really reading about it a lot and following the movement, the democracy movement in the 70s, because in the 70s, Park Chung-hee's dictatorship really cracked down, and it was a brutal torture state. It's really hard to imagine what it was like, but it was a serious torture state, surveillance state at the time. And I started reading about the opposition and the democratic movement being led in large part openly by Christians, people I'd grown up with, and people that, I'd symbolically grown up with. I was familiar with Christianity. And then I saw a lot of the movement's Christian. And so, I finally decided to go to school again, and I went to graduate school. That's when I studied about post-war Japan and Korea at that time. And, even while I was studying in the late 70s, South Korea erupted in another, big, revolutionary movement to topple the military, to topple the Park Chung-hee military government. And so, I started after Park Chung-hee, the dictator, was assassinated in 1979, and then another general took over and did a military coup and cracked down on the democracy movement and crushed it. And in Gwangju, in the city of Gwangju, where there was an armed revolt, it was crushed, and hundreds of people were killed. And so my first trip as a journalist back to Asia was about 9 months after that Gwangju massacre. And so I spent a lot of time in the early 80s in South Korea learning about the movement there and the democratic movement, the labor movement. And a lot of my openings were through, missionaries that I still knew, or people who had been friends of my parents, or, church people that were, they had contacts in Japan and the US. And that was, I'd go to this church building in Seoul and meet with Christian activists. And then, they would help set up meetings between myself and like labor organizers, people that were working with people in factories and so on. And so I really got a sense of what the movement was about in South Korea at that time. So that was really sort of the birth of my journalism.
And I mean, specifically, like, what were those first stories? Because I mean, I know that you've published some stories that have kicked off some, like, they drew a lot of attention and were serious movers in politics in Korea at the time.
In the early 1980s, getting any publication in the U.S., as a freelancer, getting anybody interested in Korea was virtually impossible. Nobody would take my stuff. Only a few left-wing publications would take it. There weren't a lot of, freelance reporters there.
Hey, let me just say, at least things are much better today. Am I right?
Absolutely. I mean, now Seoul is like the headquarters for the regional New York Times and Washington Post, and there's lots and lots of journalists there. But at that time, it was pretty lonely. But it was really hard to get my stuff published. The story of Gwangju is what really put me on the map as far as in Korea was concerned, because in 1980, when there was this coup by Chun Doo-hwan, who was a special aide. He was the intelligence chief for Park Chung-hee, the dictator who had been assassinated. And Chun Doo-hwan began to accumulate power and carried out a sort of three-stage coup where he first took control of the Korean CIA. And he first took control of the Korean military. Then he took control of the Korean CIA. And then he declared martial law and took over the whole government. And so in the day after his military coup in the southwestern city of Gwangju, people kept demonstrating against Chun Doo-hwan and the military dictatorship. And they were stomped and slaughtered in the streets for 3 days. There was terrible attacks by these special forces that Chun had sent into the city, where they brutalized the people with at first with clubs and boots, and bayonets. Hundreds of people were just massacred in those couple of days. And on the third day, the Korean Army force, they were surrounded by tens of thousands of Gwangju people, and the army just opened fire. And that's what's known as the Gwangju Massacre. 7 years later, 1987, the Korean National Assembly began to investigate Gwangju and what happened there. And of course, the U.S. had played, a pretty big role, because the U.S. The U.S. general there, the commander, is the commander of all Korean forces as well in this U.S.-Korea Joint Command. And so the U.S. commander, they released some of the forces that were sent down to Gwangju. The U.S. agreed to, these troops could be sent down there. When the Korean investigation happened at the National Assembly, the Koreans wanted the U.S. ambassador and the top U.S. general to testify. The U.S. said no, but we'll write a white paper for you, and we'll write a report on what we knew and what we didn't know. And they did that, and I went through that report that I knew was bogus, and I did a FOIA request for every meeting, every memo that was mentioned in this report. It was a great resource for a FOIA request, by the way. It took me about 4 or 5 years to get all the documents I wanted. But I finally found that the documents showed that even prior to martial law had been declared, the U.S. ambassador had met with Chun and met with a titular Korean president and said, we will understand if you need to use military forces against students.
Listen, we understand things like, every so often a society needs a Kent State to happen on, orders of magnitude larger.
Well, what I found was that the U.S. had basically given them a green light to use, military force against students who were basically peaceably demonstrating, right? And so that part of my story, where I got these documents, was very shocking to Koreans. And then also I got the minutes to a very high level, the White House meeting in the middle of the Gwangju uprising, when one day after that massacre took place, there was this high level meeting led by the Vice President Muskie at the time. It was Jimmy Carter was the president, and Brzezinski was there, and Holbrooke, and all the top officials that CIA had, the Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense. And they decided at that point, they knew there had been a military massacre. They knew that at least the day before, at least 100 people had been shot to death in the main city square. They had that information, and they knew that Chun Doo-hwan, this general, was behind it. But they still decided that they would support a military takeover of this city to put down the uprising. And they cleared the way for Chun to do that. And they also released certain troops under the Joint Command to be used to go into Gwangju. And when the minutes from that story came out in my stories, I've never had a story where the next day people demonstrated at the U.S. Embassy in Korea, but that happened. And I later learned that my stories and further stories I did after that really changed the viewpoint of a lot of Korean leftists. Like they had sort of, in the past, they had more trust of the U.S. and they after this, they realized that, the U.S. had no real interest in democratization. It was U.S. interest that always predominated. And, it was a slow wake-up call, but nevertheless, it was a wake-up call, right? And so there was, after the Gwangju, not just because of my articles, but people were really angry at the United States. So there was this whole period of anti-American demonstrations, and it went on for quite a while. But that was the one story that really made me. I joke to people, I'm not famous in America, but I'm really famous in Korea.
I mean, one thing I am curious about, is also that's like, as this happened, in the Reagan years, one of the institutions that rises to prominence in American public life is the Unification Church, and the creation of the Washington Times, which is very connected to the Reagan administration. And I was just kind of curious how you thought they, could be like fit into this picture of like the, strange, complicated, but definitively exploitative relationship between, the American political and military elite and the Korean political, and societal structure, which reaches into, cultural and religious institutions.
Well, the Moonies are bigger. They were bigger here than they were in Korea, for one thing. And they're a very strange group. I mean, the Unification Church was one of the first entities to invest in North Korea. At one point they built an automobile plant in the late 80s. So yes, they own the Washington Times and it was really right wing, but they also had these. They also had dealings with North Korea sometimes. So it's hard to kind of generalize about them. Korea, in South Korea, the predominant strain of Christianity is very, very right wing. I mean, it's extremely right wing and very fundamentalist. It's even more right wing than a lot of fundamentalist churches here. But interestingly, by 1988, 87 and 88, when Chun was very unpopular, and the U.S. I got documents from the CIA at that time saying, Chun is responsible for Gwangju and Korean people hate him, and there's like the U.S. He's not a kind of ally we want. Basically, that's what the CIA was saying. And so when Chun was thinking about declaring martial law in 1987, when there was massive demonstrations all around the country in South Korea, calling for open elections and full democracy, he was thinking about, doing another military coup. And Reagan sent an envoy, Gaston Seeger, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at the time.
What a great name, Gaston.
Well,
Gaston Seeger. It's actually known as Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, is who Reagan sent.
There you go.
That's who Reagan sent.
This guy, Gaston Seeger, used to run the Asia Foundation in Tokyo, which was a CIA front, right? So he was an old CIA hand. And incidentally, I went to high school with his son at the American School in Japan.
Right, his son, Pete Seeger.
Yeah. No, his son, Chris. But anyway, this guy, Seeger, went there and they told Chun, if you do a military coup, you're going to lose all U.S. support. So it was actually a stronger statement than Jimmy Carter ever made. It's kind of ironic.
Well, I mean, that's actually a good, it's an important point, though, about how, like, when you consider, like, American empire, and sort of like how the relationship with our different, either vassal or client states, depending on, the day or country, one of the, they get managed at different times, right? Like, James
Right.
Baker, like the most significant pressure that America has ever put on the Israeli government was James Baker under HW. Like there's it's sometimes contradictory. And, in Reagan's case, if it's like, if anything, they're the ones with the credibility politically, on domestic terms, because you can't out Cold War, the Reaganites, and also, externally, like, if the South Korean right wing elite and military is going to be reassured by anybody, it's going to be by, the most right wing Americans, I'm sure.
It is a strange anomaly, but it's true. And there's other things that Reagan did that were positive. You can count them on one, the hands of one finger, of course. I mean, at the time, so
yeah, like you can count them on the fingers of the hands of a one-armed guy.
Right. I mean, so he did the right thing in South Korea. At the same time, he's like, the U.S. is helping murder, tens of thousands of people in El Salvador.
It's also in service of throughout this entire time that we've been talking about into the 70s and 80s, like Korea and the U.S. in a sense are still at war with North Korea.
North Korea's there, but there was one thing that happened in one of the reasons that during Carter they really stuck with Chun Doo-hwan was. In the 70s there was a lot of strain between the U.S. and South Korea because, after Nixon went to China, kind of turned the tables on all these, anti-communist dictators around Asia, right? They're like, what's the U.S. going to do now? And what Nixon did, there was 2 U.S. Army divisions in Korea up at the DMZ, and he pulled the 7th Infantry right out of Korea unilaterally, didn't even talk about it with Park Chung-hee. And this really freaked out, Park Chung-hee, and they got really concerned that the U.S. was going to pull out all their forces, and they mounted this big kind of lobbying campaign that eventually became a scandal called Koreagate because they were, openly bribing people and bribing Congress people and bringing them over there on junkets and so on to show, the vulnerability of South Korea to another U.S. pullout. Over the course of the 70s, the U.S. really started building up its military alliance with Japan to counter the Soviets and the Chinese and the North Koreans. Of course, the Chinese then were sort of friendly with the U.S. But the U.S. in 1950 signed this, military alliance with Japan, and all that time since then, it had been trying to move Japan away from the peace constitution it had imposed on Japan and have it become more of a normal military power allied, with the U.S., of course. And so over time, with the conservatives in power in Japan, they began to erode the peace constitution. But in 1978, there was the U.S. and Japan rewrote their rules of engagement for their 2 militaries, the U.S. military and the Japan so-called self-defense forces. And those rules allowed Japanese ships, for example, to accompany U.S. ships overseas and stuff like that, slowly breaking down these rules that confined Japanese forces to only in Japan. And so in 1978, these new guidelines, really increased the collaboration between the U.S. and Japanese military. And at the same time, in fact, it was in 1979, just as all this, social eruption against Park Chung-hee dictatorship was coming to a head in October 1979, Harold Brown, the defense secretary, was in South Korea and agreed to, put all the past differences away, and the U.S. is here to stay, and we're going to sell you. It was like 48 F-16s, and they really, increased arms sales to South Korea, and they increased, military collaboration with South Korea as well. And so, by the time Pak was killed and Chun Doo-hwan, this other general, started taking over, the U.S. had, just sort of written the rules of its military relationship with South Korea, where it was much more high level and much more strategic. They wanted that military power there and to increase it. And then, the popular movement in South Korea threatened that alliance. And so it was like U.S. interests were now threatened by, this anti-Americanism in South Korea, which was directed at Chun. So like, okay, let's get rid of Chun and let's let them go their own way. And of course they had open, elections after that. But the U.S., intervened after that in South Korea in much more covert.
Well, and the Constitution is, written in ways, for example, like presidents can only serve one term, right? So,
in Korea, you can only serve one term.
There's which is, is a system that breeds turnover and instability because, partisanship, the ability of a party to hold and maintain power is the ability to, over time, effectively execute the vision of the majority of people in a country. That's called exerting democratic will. And so, in the case of South Korea, the Constitution, could you talk a little bit, I guess, about some of the ways in which, structurally, overtly and not so overtly, the U.S., made it so that, yes, South Korea is a democracy, but it's a very specific kind of democracy. Because, for example, just by, illustrate another dynamic, South Korea right now is, it's culturally ascendant, Parasite, Squid Game, not to mention all of the different reality TV shows and K-pop. South Korea punches well above its weight in terms of its cultural presence in terms of its population in the world. And, that's I think part of the story of that is, sort of naturally to me, has to be pretty bound up with how the country, developed and democratized. And, when people were given the freedom, or if they are given the freedom to tell stories, what that freedom is and what are the kinds of stories that they choose to tell and what are the kinds of cultural products that they end up making. And what are the ones that they end up making about their own conflict, like the reality shows? I'm kind of curious, I guess, about that other, sort of evolution of South Korea as it's sort of coming into its own in this time, and so on.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point because, actually a lot of the Korean culture, if you know the Korean past, if you know the story of Gwangju, for example, if you know in some of their past dealings with Japan as colony and so on, a lot of their culture is about that. It's built in. What's that? There's that film. Bong Joon-ho has that famous film about the train.
Snowpiercer.
Snowpiercer, right? Okay, it's about these people in the end. The poor people at the end of the car. Move car by car, and they finally take over the engine, right? I and other people who are familiar with Korean history, see that as that's the history of the South Korean, democratic struggle too, because they had a lot of initial early losses. There was a revolution in 1960 that I observed. The 1960 revolution against Syngman Rhee. 1 year later, there was a military coup. Did away with any changes that had happened and started repressing all the people that came out of the woodwork when there was finally democracy. That was crushed. The Gwangju uprising was crushed. It took 7 more years before there could be, full democracy. So they had this history, and a lot of that film is sort of a very symbolic of the way Korea finally stood up. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of their literature. There's very famous books about Gwangju. You see it, and also there's a lot of their films. Lately, I've been because I've been writing about sort of Korea under Japanese colonialism. I've been watching films, about that period, and it's really interesting to see these films. There's one film I saw the other day about a huge. The story is about there was lots of Korean slave labor was brought to Japan during the war, right? And it was industrial labor, but it was also forced sex slavery. And there's a movie about a rebellion on this island right off of Nagasaki. That was this huge mine, and where they imported all these Korean slaves basically to work in the mines, and then they brought women to service the Japanese soldiers that were there. And there was in the movies about a rebellion against the Japanese, and a lot of the Koreans escaped from the island. But all this stuff is part of their history, and that's the part of the history that gets played out in a lot of their literature and a lot of films. But like Americans just have like no idea of that. Like don't have any idea that Japan was the colonizer in Korea and how cruel it was. And I'm hoping that by the popularity of those films and the other stuff that's on TV, that people are starting to learn a little bit about that. Like there's a series now called Pachinko that's on the Apple channel. That's an amazing story of the Korean migration to out of Korea during the colonial period into Japan, and the struggles that families had to go through in that period. And I think a lot of Americans are finally learning about this history, and that, every time Tony Blinken says, hey, we need the South Korea and Japan to be friends, you got to stop squabbling about these past things. Well, Japan will never apologize, under the control of the conservatives, refuses to deal with its wartime atrocities, refuses to acknowledge them. And in fact, one of the big disputes now between South Korea and Japan is over that island where that rebellion took place in the movie. That island is called Hashima Island. And Japan has been pushing very hard to get it placed on the UNESCO list of historical sites, right? But in the Japanese literature about it, they never once mentioned the slave labor. And so the South Koreans have really objected to that. And that's now a big issue before UNESCO, because Japan does not want to have this thing blessed by the UN as a museum if there's no mention of the Koreans who died by the hundreds in those mines.
Right. And it's interesting because there's also, I think, it's interesting because over the course of the 20th century and for, the last 20 years, I suppose, the US was the power that could just, manage those fights.
Well, I was noticing this morning, like, the US is talking about imposing, heavy sanctions on India, right? For like, still selling stuff to Russia and still not, breaking relations with Russia, right? And it's like, we didn't even do that during the Cold War. India was an ally of the Soviet Union, and they bought a lot of their military hardware from the Soviet Union. The U.S. at that time was like tried to win them over, from that, but they didn't like impose sanctions and do economic warfare against them. And I think it's a sign, as you say, of the weakening of the U.S. empire. They wouldn't have to take these drastic steps, to try to shore up their imperial control.
Precisely. And so I'm kind of curious about, like, from the 1980s until now, when North Korea got the bomb, how that also, sort of transformed things and changed the way that the politics, this political struggle that you've been sort of describing unfolding over the years, how that, continued to play out.
Well, the first thing to say about the nuclear confrontation is that it was the United States that first introduced nuclear weapons to Korea. When they, after the Korean War, when they signed this alliance with Korea to guarantee U.S. troop presence there, by 1957, they were bringing in American nuclear weapons. And they stationed them fully throughout the South Korean Peninsula, in 1958. And they were there until 1991, when George H.W. Bush pulled U.S. tactical nuclear weapons out of South Korea and a bunch of other countries. But the fact is, it's the U.S. that introduced them first. And, North Korea didn't start developing them until the late 1980s, when there were still nuclear weapons in the South. And they saw nuclear weapons as possibly, one way they could protect themselves from what had happened during the Korean War when the country.
And that is such a key point, because North Korea was the country, Japan suffered 2 atomic bombings. North Korea probably after Vietnam and Cambodia, North Korea, I mean, just in terms of like per capita, I mean, it was the proving ground for the kind of brutal air war that was meant to, that we saw. When I say air war, I mean bombing war, indiscriminate bombing war that you would see in Vietnam as well. We interviewed Bruce Cummings last week, and one of the things that we talked with him about in sort of this discussion was the way in which it was not strategic bombardment, or maybe it was, if the strategy was about fear. They used napalm because it was terrifying and it burned down houses and cities and caused casualties and so on, and experimented with all sorts of other things. I guess I'd kind of put it to you. How would you formulate it? What is the reasoning for why North Korea would develop the atomic bomb, considering the scope of having been the brunt of all that brutal air weaponry?
Well, not only that, they, after Bush Jr. put them on the axis of evil list, they saw what happened to Iraq. And then later they saw what happened to Libya. Libya had actually, got rid of its nuclear program, right, under Gaddafi. And then the U.S. took them out anyway. And then, of course, Iraq, they took out Saddam Hussein and tried to take full control of Iraq. But neither of them had nuclear weapons. And, so it's a survival. It's survival. It's also an extremely militarized state. The military has incredible amount of power in North Korea, and so much of their resources is devoted, to military development. And obviously their technology is pretty good because they're blasting off rockets that hardly any other country has, and missiles. But the same technique. I mean, the U.S. bombing of Japan was so horrific. It's hard to even imagine. And there wasn't much reporting on the Korean bombing because most of it was in North Korea. But for example, doing some of my research for my book, I'm looking at some of the what U.S. generals like Curtis LeMay said about its bombing of Japan, right? Like on March 9th, 1945. Probably one of the deadliest days, 24 hours in human history. 300 B-29s flew from Guam, and they, bombed Tokyo, right? Turned Tokyo into a raging inferno. At least 100,000 people died that night from the bombs. And later, LeMay says the Japanese were literally scorched and boiled and baked to death. And people in Japan describe scenes from hell, people just crowding into rivers, black bodies floating like logs. All that remained were pieces of charred meat. It was just, and MacArthur's own psychological warfare chief, this guy named Bonner Fellers, did a memo that the firebombings of Japan were one of the most ruthless and barbaric killings of non-combatants in all history. 66 cities destroyed, 40% of their urban areas reduced to ashes, 30% of the people made homeless. In Korea, every city was destroyed. All of their urban areas, 100% was reduced to ashes. There was no targets left. Koreans never forgot that. And the other thing about the U.S. bombing of North Korea is that the U.S. bombed South Korea too. It's just incredible to read stories in the 1990s under a progressive government in South Korea. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission created to look into war crimes during the Korean War. And what they found was, even when the U.S. when MacArthur invaded Incheon with the Navy fleet and Marines, to cut off the North Koreans when he went into Incheon, they just came in to the nearby islands and just sprayed napalm everywhere and killed hundreds of people, civilians. That's how the U.S. liberated Korea, was with napalm. And, people in North and South Korea never forgot that. And the thing is, like in South Korea, I remember I said a while ago that, even the U.S. diplomat at one point said 100,000 people were executed in the South even before the Korean War on suspicions of being communists. Those people who lost, their families, lost their loved ones from mass executions of communists and communist sympathizers and also U.S. bombing were never allowed to mourn until there was democracy. It's really hard to understand what that does to a people, but they could not even hold a public service to acknowledge that their people had died at the hands of right-wing death squads, or that their people had died in U.S. bombing. It was seen as a national security risk, and so they would be oppressed and they'd be jailed, and it's so like democratization also meant coming to grips with their history, what had happened. And that really did change Korea, especially during the 80s and 90s when the history books, when people really started looking into what happened in Jeju. People did not know what had happened in Jeju, for decades, where at least 30,000 people were killed in this counterinsurgency. And even Gwangju, because of the control of the press, lots of Koreans have told me this. They didn't even know what happened in Gwangju until about, when they got to college, years later, things like that. This history was always hidden.
That actually leads me, I think, to my last question for you, which is about how, one of the things that feels like the very tragic and like the sad, aside from obviously like the lives lost of the people who were physically harmed by this, the way in which North Koreans and South Koreans, Korea, a singular nation, cousins, families, sisters, mothers, brothers, fathers, have spent a lifetime apart. The division at the 38th parallel is unnatural in the sense that, eliminating the coastal plain from North Korea gives the North virtually, none of the raw materials it can need to survive as an independent state, and so on. I was just kind of curious, I guess, how you would describe the ways in which, South and North Korea, having been pit against each other for so long, over the course of your lifetime, how, that opposition, sort of set up and, obviously not administered for either of those countries and their people's own interest, how the nature of it has changed and how it's changed South Koreans, or to the extent that you feel confident saying, that is North Korea has changed, in what way it has.
Well, it's a little hard for me to answer that because I haven't actually physically been in Korea since 2018. So that's like 4 years now. But
well, sure. I mean, even over your lifetime, more broadly,
over my lifetime, I think, lots of South Koreans went from being, super, hated North Korea for what they did, the invasion, everything that followed, had people having to, I knew people when I was a kid who had to, fleeing the fighting. They would walk all the way across Korea with just, their little few belongings on their head. Right. And, it was a terrible time, and, so many people died, and there was just so much tragedy and destruction, and people blame North Korea for it. But at the same time, there was this real animosity toward the U.S. because people knew, even though it wasn't publicized, that, the U.S. had stood by while right-wing death squads went around killing suspected communists and women and children that were, families of suspected communists. And people knew all this went on. And so their feelings were mixed. And so, that's why I was so surprised when I was there as a college kid in 72, and I saw this outpouring of joy when the North Koreans came through. It was like people, want to have one nation again and want to, see their relatives again and see their families again. But I think over time, of course, people are getting older. There's a lot of people most people are born way since the Korean War. And so the memories of it and the divisions even are not very strong anymore. And so the bonds, the nationalist bonds that, hoping for unification have really slipped. And so now you have, it's hard to describe the politics of it because, while Moon Jae-in, who is still in power, who's this progressive who was elected in 2017, he was elected on a platform of engagement with North Korea. And that's how he won. He actually won overwhelmingly over the right wing in that election in 2017. And I was in Korea for that election. And overwhelmingly, people wanted to have an end to, the conflict and an end to the tensions with North Korea. And when I was there in living in Gwangju in 2017, that's when, Trump was threatening, fire and hell, to attack North Korea and burn them up like Truman burned them up. He was using language very similar to that Truman used before Hiroshima, right? The destruction nobody has ever seen before, and this kind of threat, right? And a lot of South Koreans were far more worried about what the U.S. was going to do than North Korea, because they've had all these war scares year after year after year. And of course, the North Koreans know if they ever, if they attacked with South Korea, especially with anything nuclear, they would be wiped out. They would be destroyed. And so people in South Korea were far more afraid of what the U.S. did. And I think that, when the U.S. was very unpopular and U.S. forces were very unpopular, the U.S., part of the reason for the unpopularity was that, the U.S. military in Korea was stationed at this gigantic base smack in the middle of Seoul called Yongsan. And there were, American soldiers were everywhere. And so the U.S. consolidated its bases over the last 15 years to a huge base about 80 miles south of Seoul. And that's now Camp Humphreys. It's now the largest U.S. military base in the world outside the U.S. But they also they've removed all the U.S. forces from Yongsan. What happens to that land is still in dispute, but so they moved out to sort of get them out of the Korean eye in a way. And so, so there's still a lot of concern about, North Korea and what might happen. And there's a lot of South Koreans have sort of changed their views, especially younger Koreans. Like I saw some articles in the last couple of days about recent polls showing that growing number of people in South Korea think South Korea should get nuclear arms to protect themselves, not only against North Korea, but if the U.S. pulls out, right? And so I think the feelings have not changed so much as that, people are making different choices. Like, okay, I guess if we're going to have peace, we'll all be able to live with the U.S. forces being here, and then as long as they're out of sight, then I won't worry about North Korea. It's hard to characterize, but I think you don't have the same yearning for unification and resolution like you did even 15 years ago. And I think that's kind of sad, but I think that there's still,
listen, hope comes from unexpected places like Donald Trump.
Right. Well, the thing is, like the Korean who was just elected, Yoon, who's going to take over in May from Moon Jae-in, this guy is extreme rightist. And he has called for unilateral strikes on North Korea. He's a real militarist. He's also a shamanist, and he doesn't do anything without his shaman telling him it's the right thing. But he won so narrowly. He won by less than 300,000 votes in a country of 30 million. So was 20 million, 30 million? But it's like his. It is so narrow, and there's this awful surge of young Korean males turning against women and turning against women's rights, and saying, thinking that women are taking away their jobs and all this kind of thing. There's this real, reaction from men about women that played out in this election, because the right-wing candidate, pledged to shut down this bureau of, sexual equality they have in the government and this kind of thing. And so there's this generation of young Korean men that are kind of like really despise women and women having any kind of power. And it's a very strange kind of politics that I frankly do not understand, but I see reports from it all the time. And people I know that are living there just going, oh, I just don't get this,
I mean, I will say, and perhaps this is a good note to end on, is that I actually think that you can see a lot of what you're describing in, other political struggles elsewhere and in other, developed countries. I mean, at least that's where I feel confident making comparisons, like to, the transphobia scare that we're currently seeing in, the South. I mean, particularly in Florida and in Texas, where the value of it as a tool to mobilize a political base, when you don't have policy prescriptions that can deal with the very real crises that that we're confronting. Because South Korea is it's an incredibly competitive bureaucratic society with a very limited number of opportunities and entrenched class structures through all this period of turmoil that we've been describing, and that it has cultural politics that are kind of like ours, given the kind of stakes that are that are at play, that are in play for most people's lives. I mean, in Korea, they have in living memory, kinds of war and violence that Americans, have never been witness to in our lifetime for the most part. I think that that's a real, it's part of what freights their politics with it. It's something to be respectful of and mindful of. On that note, Tim Shorrock, this has been an awesome pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you so much. This was great.